For years, we relied on Moore's law, the idea that the number of transistors on a chip doubles approximately every 2 years. And it has led to exponential growth in computing power, powering the digital revolution up until now. However, this rate is slowing down, and we are bumping into some hard physical limits. In this video, we will discuss a new computer chip that will escape the lab already this year and might break through all the limits. There are many billions of personal computers and approximately 100 million servers operating worldwide. And soon we could have a cloud for every person with artificial intelligence embedded everywhere. And this consumes tremendous amount of energy. But why? Physicists have been asking this question for a long time, but it wasn't until 1961 when Rolf Landauer at IBM discovered a surprising answer. Information has a cost. Each bit of information costs us energy, and that is tied to the laws of physics, particularly thermodynamics. And since then, it became known as a Landauer limit, which states that for every operation you perform, you need to expend a minimum amount of energy. In fact, flipping a bit from 0 to 1 costs us that much energy at room temperature. And that's an incredibly small number. Typically, we should not care. But when you're computing billions or trillions of bits, like the latest NVIDIA GPU, for example, it all adds up, consuming lots of energy. But what do we get for this energy? We get information as the output, the result of the operation. What's interesting, almost 100% of the energy in the modern computer chips are dissipated as heat. So, essentially, wasted. Now, just think for a moment, what if we could store this energy in the system and recycle it to reuse it for future computations? Could we build a chip that runs at no energy at all, never heating up and breaking the Landauer limit? In the times of Landauer, it was neither possible nor practical. However, a new chip which is coming out this year might break this limit. Why do we care about breaking this limit? In fact, for the past 60 years, semiconductor industry was able to exponentially reduce the amount of energy spent per bit on each operation, because the transistors were getting smaller, operating voltage going down, capacitor you need to charge is getting smaller, so you spend less and less energy per bit on each operation. And that's beautiful. What's happening right now is that even though the Landauer limit is very small, we are getting very close to it. Right now, we are just a few orders of magnitude away from it.
When you talk to chip designers, one of the things that you will hear is that, we are so far away from Landauer's limit, right? And this is true and false at the same time, because yes, we're fairly far away. But with CMOS, we're not. It's CMOS the problem. In CMOS, we're actually we're basically at the end of the roadmap, right? And so for us is that, sure, Landauer's limit is super far away, but the point is CMOS already finished. And so what do? We're going in this gap that is between one Landauer and where we are today, right? And where we can grow reversibly and no one else can.
Interestingly, Landauer himself found that actually it's reversibility that places a lower limit on energy consumption. Later on, my all-time favorite, Richard Feynman, explored this problem in depth, questioning whether it might be possible to surpass the Landauer limit. And actually, he concluded that there was no theoretical minimum of energy required for computation if in the process we do not lose the bits of information, essentially if we don't erase the data. And that's very interesting, because for the entire history of computing, computer chips were built in a way that we intentionally erase the information when it's no longer needed. This is the best understood by an example. If we take a simple logic gate, which all computer chips are constructed from, an AND gate, for example, It's a very simple structure that combines two input bits into one output bit, ensuring that multiple conditions are true before allowing an action. So, if both inputs are true, both inputs are 1, it gives true, so 1 at the output. If one of the inputs is 0, it gives an output of 0. The problem is that all modern computers implement so-called irreversible logic, which means once computed, you cannot run it simply backwards. You cannot reproduce the inputs. Looking back at the gate, if I know that I have 0 at the output, and I try to run the operation in the reverse, I can't reproduce it. Even when I know that the output is 0, I'm still not clear what the input was. There are many possible combinations of inputs, which gives me 0 at the output. This kind of logic is irreversible. So once it's computed, it's gone, and you can't get it back. And the most important, the energy is wasted. But what if we can build a computer where we don't waste any information? Can we then recover this energy? Landauer himself proved it was possible. He found that the loss of energy was due to the destruction of information, not from the execution of operation itself. So if we were able to build a reversible computer, theoretically, we could compute using no energy at all.
It turns out that when you use reversible computing, you can really kind of decouple the generation of heat from the processing of information. And it's difficult to translate that into kind of terms where we could construct logic. But when you figure that out, it then allows you to, in principle, significantly reduce the energy dissipation, thereby the energy consumption of computing.
At first, it's really hard to comprehend, just because most of the things we experience in our lives are irreversible. Take aging, for example. Or when you pour hot coffee in a mug, it spreads heat to the mug, right, and into the air, and the coffee is cooling down. And it's irreversible without external intervention. And we know that from the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the total entropy of the system either stays the same or increases, never decreases. What is even more interesting, that the most fundamental laws of physics are reversible. Means if you know the state of a closed system at some point, you can always run it in reverse and determine its state at any previous moment. If we take a game of billiards, for example, if you film it, it would look normal played forward or backward, because the physics of collisions is the same, so you could easily predict their past or their future positions. And the same reversibility holds for quantum computing. Take D-wave quantum computer, for example. Quantum gates are always reversible. Couldn't we just apply the same principles to conventional processors? 60 years ago, Landauer considered this idea impractical. Back then, if we wanted to make computation reversible, we would need to store every input and every intermediate result, and doing so would quickly fill up the memory. But later on, his colleague, Charles Bennett, found another way. He thought, what if instead of just storing intermediate results in memory, once the result is no longer needed, one could just reverse the computation. This has a huge advantage, because in this case, we only need to store the result of the operation and one of the inputs, and then we can reverse it back. Let's get back to our example. If we take the AND gate and add an extra output, copying one of the original inputs, then knowing these two values, we can reverse the operation. If I know that the output is 0 and one of the inputs was 1, I'm immediately certain that the second input was 0. With that, I can reverse the operation or decompute it, getting back the energy that was used in computation. Of course, at the computer level, it's way more complicated. But in principle, we understand now that it is possible to recover the operation, to reverse the operation. But how does it help us to get back the energy? Let's have a look. There is a startup that is building the first commercial reversible computer. This computer chip implements reversible logic, which we've just discussed. So they took the standard logic gates and adjusted them to work in reversible fashion. And typically it's quite a hassle. But in this case, it's good that this is compatible with our traditional manufacturing process. And of course, these gates are still take energy to switch from 0 to 1. But the trick is, as long as this energy is not dissipated as heat, but stored in the transistor, they are able to recover it at the decomputation step. And they're getting close to it. The first prototype is coming out already this year.
It's kind of interesting. So normally reversible computing requires both a forward and a backward step. This isn't quite necessarily true. So it kind of depends on the paradigm of reversible computing you're considering. It is the easiest approach to do reversible computing, where you compute one step forward and then one step backwards. And this is because you can embed kind of any traditional algorithm that we've already developed over the last 100 or so years of computing. You can embed that in a reversible computer by kind of computing it forwards, saving the output, and then decomputing kind of all of the intermediate and temporary data that you generated. And so kind of this allows us to just automatically reversibilize anything that we already have and save almost all of the energy.
Now, let me guess what you're thinking. How does computing twice help us to recover the energy? And it's a good one. Here, they're actually connecting the logic gates to a resonator through the power rails. And this is a very interesting trick.
Yeah, we do that by essentially embedding the reversible logic circuits in a resonant oscillator. Currently, it's a LC oscillator consisting of an inductor and a capacitor, which is the capacitance of the logic. As the energy sloshes back and forth, so to speak, between the logic and the resonator, or between different parts of the logic through the inductor and the resonator, only a small fraction of it is dissipated. And so you're essentially recovering and recycling most of the charging energy rather than dissipating it as heat. So that's kind of the basic principle.
Well, a resonator is a kind of a pendulum that swings. It oscillates naturally back and forth. And it's just like a swinging pendulum that stores energy as it moves. In case of this computer chip, instead of a swinging pendulum, we have a resonator, where at the resonant frequency, energy is bouncing back and forth between an inductor and a capacitor. And if there were no friction, it could bounce there forever. On the upswing, the computation step is performed, and the energy goes to the logic, charging the capacitor. And on the downswing, the computation step is performed, and the energy goes back to the resonator. It's a very clever way. It took me quite some time to understand this, but essentially it comes down to basic electronics. If your logic gates seem as a capacitor and you connect an inductor to it, and you make it to resonate, the energy bounces back and forth. And if you still haven't gotten it just yet, don't worry, just swing through this part once again. Of course, in reality, there will be always some energy lost due to the prosthetics, the resonator quality, device characteristics. So we will need some energy to make it to keep going. What's interesting, there is one more trick they're using together with reversibility. They're using so-called adiabatic technique for bringing the energy to the logic gates, for charging those capacitors. This means that instead of charging them abruptly, they are slowly ramping up the voltage with controlled current. And this allows to further reduce the energy consumption.
It turns out that if you are following strictly the rules required for fully adiabatic switching, it requires the logic to be reversible. You can't erase information under that constraint. And so when you compute some information and then you want to get rid of it, you have to then decompute it by essentially doing the opposite of the transformation that computed that information in the first place. And so that's the connection to reversible logic.
And with this approach, they can theoretically achieve energy efficiency gains of more than 3 orders of magnitude compared to conventional chips, eliminate heat dissipation, and potentially break the Landauer limit. And this approach is very promising for applications like machine learning, AI inference, and in general for building low power systems. And the most exciting part that their first prototype is coming out in early 2025. And I'm looking forward to see the measurement results of how much energy they're actually able to recover in practice and then recycle in the system. And at the same time, they are working on the next chip, which is designed to perform multiply accumulate operations for AI inference applications.
Right now, everyone is recycling 0, right? We just need to prove that it's non-zero, right? Because the moment that we prove that it's non-zero and that we don't use more energy, which basically simulation suggests that's the case, at that point, we know we open up the entire tech tree for reversible computing, and that becomes like an engineering problem, right?
Of course, when you are pioneering a new approach to computing, there are many challenges to solve. The first big trade-off of this approach is area. Reversible logic takes more space on the silicon. And the resonator itself is quite big. It's in micrometer range. With so much effort going into shrinking transistors, why would we be willing to sacrifice area in this case? Well, in fact, if you take the most powerful NVIDIA GPU or an AMD GPU, what's happening already now that a big chunk of logic cannot be computing all at once due to the power and thermal constraints.
In conventional chips, the performance per area is not actually limited by the area taken by individual logic gates. It's limited by power dissipation constraints, right? So, at least by a factor of 10 or 100, you could compute much, much faster, right, if it wasn't for the power dissipation of the gates. And there's a lot of dark silicon on today's chips because of this. You can't actually actively run, you can't tile the chip with gates that are actively switching on every cycle. It would just overheat. And so because of this, we've actually got some breathing room to play with. You could afford to spend a little more area on your gates if you make them more energy efficient, and you could actually get greater aggregate throughput per die area.
And the ongoing trends, building larger chips, vertical integration, stacking chips on top of each other, making the situation even worse. And apart of this, of course, many challenges remain. The first one has to do with the technology and manufacturing, building reversible logic gates and building a high-quality resonator, and then integrating them all together into a single chip. And on top of that, they have to build the whole software stack for this new hardware. And we know that's a lot of work. What's making it even more complicated is that typically reversible computers require reversible algorithms and reversible programming. But luckily, in this case, they managed to hide, so to say, all the reversibility at the circuits level.
As we get to more and more advanced reversible computers, you can generate more reversible algorithms, which kind of do not necessarily require these backward steps. But for now, we can already get a lot of gains just by adding in this extra backward step without really sacrificing performance.
As I mentioned in my previous videos, I always admire people who are pioneering new approaches to computing because it's a lot of hard work, which sometimes take a decade. But just think about it. If we could build a reversible computer which operates adiabatically, we could solve the biggest problem, the heat dissipation problem. And then we could truly go vertical, stacking more chiplets on top of each other. building truly 3D chips. And this could open the whole new era in computing. Interestingly, there are alternative implementations of reversible computers ongoing. And one of the prominent approaches is building reversible computers with light. And in general, computing with light is a very promising approach. And I'm working on one big episode about it, so make sure to subscribe not to miss it. Other researchers are working on a superconducting implementation of reversible computers and also on a molecular implementation using DNA. But don't ask me how DNA computing works. To me, the new year is a perfect time to develop new skills and take your career to the next level. This video is brought to you by boot.dev, the go-to platform for learning how to code. With boot.dev, you can master backend development using Python and Go in a self-paced, game-like manner. Their platform guides you through writing real code, combining essential theory with hands-on projects. After all, the best way to learn programming is by building real-world applications. As a computer engineering major, I spent years coding in C# and C++, but back then I didn't have an opportunity to learn Python. It wasn't until I started working as a chip designer I realized that Python is fundamental, essential for scripting and beyond. And today, knowing Python is a must-have skill for anyone in tech. So if you're looking to take your career to the next level, boot.dev is a perfect place to start. Use my code Anastasia to get 25% off the entire first year if you choose an annual plan. Check them out through the link below, and thank you boot.dev for sponsoring this episode.